What's happening, YouTube? This is Haze Anderson. I thought I'd do a little morning chat with you and just kind of see how this works out. This is definitely not my normal format, but right now I have the ability to do this kind of stuff, so let's see what happens. This morning I'm drinking some instant coffee using almond milk, and it's really darn good, believe it or not. So I don't have any notes with me. I probably will in the future have notes before I do these shows and have something more concrete to talk about. It may not be in this spot every time. Once I get my studio set up in the apartment, I'll probably film from there. The lighting and the sound will definitely be better. I'll probably start using my mixer, use a microphone, but for right now this will do. I'm powering the camera with this really cool USB power bank. Just thought I'd point that out. Should last for a few hours, but hopefully I won't go for more than 30 minutes. The sun's going to start coming down this way, coming across the sky, and it's going to hit me in the face. And once that happens, I'm done filming. Okay, so I guess we could just kind of start talking a little bit about who I am. I'm an older dude, believe it or not. I've been around for a long time. I've been playing music for a very, very long time, decades. I've been doing MIDI programming with synthesizers for a long time as well. I started doing that at the end of '93. And I stopped doing it towards the late 90s because I got out of music production and into straight computer programming. And that has been my career ever since I graduated with a computer science degree at the end of '99. And from there, however, I still continued to play drums. I mean, really, that's where I started, was playing drums. But really, that's not where I started. Before that was on saxophone. So as you can see, it's a long story. Maybe someday I'll go into it, but right now I don't think is really the time. I want to try to keep things at least somewhat focused on what you're here about, which is synthesizers. And specifically, how do I put this? This particular style that we use synthesizers. Many of us are not really traditional piano players. Many of us are musicians, but most of us are not really piano players. And I think that's where the great divide comes in between our community. Pardon as a car goes by. It's a really lovely day today. It probably will get extremely warm. It's about 9:30 right now, so the temperature is still fairly nice. I have no idea what it is. I never pay attention to the temperature anyways, and really try not to pay attention to what time of the day it is if I can help it. So yeah, once again, I'm not really a piano player. Maybe you are. Maybe you started on the piano. The acoustic piano is a very, very special instrument. I mean, if you think about it, you know, that is kind of the ultimate, not really genesis, but, you know, the foundation of what we are doing with this particular craft that we're involved in, hobby, whatever you want to call it. Maybe you are a true professional. I, right now, am not a professional. I am not making any money whatsoever from this hobby that I'm doing. I'm strictly a hobbyist when it comes to this. At some point, I could switch over to being a professional. I have no idea. I don't really have much of a desire to do that right now. I'm kind of happy where I'm at, although I'm not exactly happy being a programmer anymore. Also not happy with my hair. Fixing to get this lopped off and probably just get my entire head shaved off. I like to do that in the summertime just for ease. One thing I can't stand is when I'm dealing with hooking up equipment. This happening all the time, getting my eyes. And my eyesight's bad enough as it is anyways, so long hair is just no-go for me anymore. And I don't even get to the points where I can pull it back into a ponytail. That's the worst stage in the world, and anybody who's had long hair knows about that. So probably today or tomorrow I'm just going to go get it lopped off. And hopefully the next time you see me, I'll look completely different. I will miss this luxurious long locks that I've been growing, but you know, what are you going to do? So yeah, I'm not a piano player. Maybe you are. And maybe that kind of fuels your quest for polyphony. Because that is the #1 thing that I see on YouTube. The biggest request of all, I think, is, does it have polyphonic aftertouch? And I'm always wondering, you know, why do you need that? Why would you want that in the first place? And I think what the answer, you know, everybody has a different answer, of course, but I think most answers will stem from the fact that you want your synthesizer to behave like a piano. And I think that's totally valid. I really, really do. Unfortunately, it's kind of an uphill battle. Most synthesizers are just not pianos. And really, if that is kind of what you're ultimately going for, you haven't kind of figured out already that you're trying to fit a square thing into a circular plug, whatever that thing is, you know, you're making your life a lot harder. Really, probably what you should do is just get a piano. Now, why would anybody want to have to move a piano around in the 21st century? Yeah, that's the other problem, is that pianos are huge. It takes several people to move them. You have to have the right space for them. You really need a good room for them as well, because they're completely acoustic. They are the sound source. So in this particular case, you know, you don't have headphones that you can just plug into it, or a line out that you can take speakers out of. You need a good room for that as well. You need the space. So they're very expensive propositions. And piano has always been a very, I'm not sure like what the adjective I'm looking for there. I don't want to say privileged. That's just too much of a gross overstatement, you know. But definitely you do need to have means to have a piano, I do believe. My friends, you know, several decades ago who did not have means, they had a piano. You can find these old kind of school pianos, the upright ones, that are kind of always out of tune. They're beat up and need some work and so forth. No problem. But again, you know, you're going to have a lot of people pick that sucker up to move it anytime you move, and it really is just, I mean, unless you are a professional pianist, it starts to not really make sense, and at some point you're probably going to get rid of that thing. So now we come to our next, you know, kind of step down. You know, I would argue, why not get something like a Wurlitzer or a Rhodes, some kind of an electric piano that is the next best step between something that is purely acoustic and something that is purely electrical. And they're not digital for the most part. They're a hybrid. They have a little bit of both in them, but really no digital. So I think that would be a good choice. But again, they don't sound like pianos. I mean, you're not going to be able to play true classical music on that kind of stuff. So yeah, from there I would say, like, check out the Piano Forever's channel. James Pavel Shawcross's channel. He goes over a whole lot of digital pianos, acoustic pianos, and the differences between them, and you know, really check out his show and kind of start investigating those avenues. Because if you're looking down the analog realms for these kinds of solutions, I mean, you know, you've got the DeepMind 6 and 12, you've got all of the Dave Smith instruments, you've got the Moogs, the Moog 1, and these are all very expensive synthesizers. And at the end of the day, you're not really going to get the sounds that you're looking for, I don't believe. Not if you're coming from wanting a piano type kind of thing. You know, the what is this new Behringer that's coming out? The OBX? Yeah, they're a clone of the OBX. It's funny because I'm really not interested in it. Wow. That is a cool jet going overhead, right? Probably only 200 feet above me. About maybe 300 yards. I would say about maybe 200 yards above me, about 300 yards out. I wish I could have turned the camera around so you could have seen that, but that was a sight to see. There is an airport to the north that way. And I might want to think about turning myself around and catch a case something like that again. It was somebody's private jet. It's pretty cool looking. But at any rate, whatever it is, the OBX, you know, I don't even know what it's called. I'm sure that is what it is, but it's because I'm really not interested in that kind of synthesizer. I may get one though, with that kind of price, and if everything pans out correctly with it, there's no issues. I'm going to get to something here in a second, because we now have our first real issue, problem child, I think, to show up on the market. But this new OBX, I mean, it looks cool and everything, but I'm just really not into that kind of thing. I'm really more of a monophonic synthesizer kind of person, and I always have been. Maybe it's because I started out on the saxophone. I really don't know. But anytime I think about, like, you know, the greatest riffs, you know, from a guitar, which is a polyphonic instrument, up to 12 strings, you know, or a bass guitar, which pretty much is, you know, it is a 4-string polyphonic instrument, but you tend to play it monophonically, is that all of these really cool solo lines and great bass lines, they're all monophonic. That's all, excuse me, that's all my favorite type kind of stuff right there. So for me, like, the polyphony has never really been something that I've been desiring. I mean, I do like pads and so forth, but hey, have you ever heard of a thing called reverb? And I think people get that confused a lot. That is, the actual effects that you can have within a synthesizer versus what the oscillator does through the filters and the envelope generators and your amplifiers and so forth. It is easy to do that. I know that for the longest time I had a lot of things all kind of in the same basket. I didn't realize how separate these things really were. And the importance is that you can get these specific sounds once you know what they are without having to have the whole kit and caboodle. So you don't need necessarily a $4,000 12 voice polyphonic synthesizer that has onboard effects when you can get a handful of cheaper synthesizers, have them work in tandem, and then have them use a few different effects and put all that together. You actually get a bigger sound than you would think, because even though you're getting 12 voices and all of your effects right there in one box, well, guess what? You're also got one line out. Maybe a stereo, but it's just one device. That's a little bit hard to kind of come by sometimes, but you know, that is my biggest thing, is that, you know, while I've never really been much of a groove box person either, is because you've just got one output coming out of that. Some of them have individual outs, and that definitely changes everything in my opinion. But most of them pretty much just offer a stereo output, and you can get a pretty decent sound with that. But when you start adding more and more on top of that, you get a bigger sound, a much more unique and defined sound, sort of tailored to what you are about. Whereas when you get something that is just a one box groove box, it's always going to just kind of sound like it, and anybody else that's using it, well, it's going to kind of sound like their stuff too. I think a great example of that is that if anybody that has the Roland Boutique TB-03 synthesizer, I think you know darn well what I'm talking about. I will say that I've experienced this personally, and I think that you have too, is that you've been listening to someone else's jam that uses that instrument, and all of a sudden you realize, oh wow, that sounds just exactly like something that I did. I mean, not the whole jam, but that one just particular sound. I don't want to get too much into it, but the original TB-303, you know, by now you should understand that if you have 5 different of the original boxes, the TB-303, they're all going to sound different. And the only way for you to have a digital recreation is for you to kind of just sort of pick one. It would be nice if Roland had some way to change a number of different component values. Of course, it's all virtual, but that's basically what it would have been down to, is being able to change certain component values so that you get these different variances in sounds. Because my TB-03 sounds just like everybody else's TB-03 out there on YouTube, and hence why I try to use it sparingly and a little differently, and probably why I have a whole bunch of analog TB-303 clones. How many do I have now? 5 clones, 2 Cyclone Analogics and 3 Behringers. Speaking of which, looks like we have our first problem child on the market, and I guess that was the now probably no longer to be sold original RD8, and now there's the RD8 Mark II, and I don't know, that's kind of not awesome in my opinion. It's not very awesome that Behringer had to do that, chose to did that, whatever reason. Again, it's not my bag, really, to tell you the truth. I mean, if you've noticed, I've never had an RD8. When I first saw the RD8, I didn't like the way it looked. You may think that that's a petty argument for something, but to tell you the truth, nah, not really, because hey, conversely, I believe that my Roland Boutique TR-08 sounds awesome. I don't think that it sounds like everybody else's per se, or even if it does, that's okay because it's drums. And I really, you know, that's a whole nother topic that I want to talk about someday. But people spend far too much effort trying to get these drum sounds to be a certain way, or you know, it's a whole nother topic. I could just spend hours and hours and hours talking about this, because the one thing that I love about these drum machines is that you have the ability to change these sounds anyways. You see, when I go into a studio and to record my drum set, what we're going for, myself and the engineer, anybody else involved in the recording process, is we're trying to get the cleanest recording that we can get. No noise, no clattering and ringing in the background, because drums can be very, very noisy. What I mean by that is, you know, rattly. Things can rattle on a drum set. You want to make sure that all of that's taken care of, gone, eliminated, all problems corrected. You don't want your toms to necessarily warble and ring and linger on a whole lot after you hit. There's tricks that you can do with noise gates and so forth, but really what we're trying to do when we first go in and record those drums is we want to try to get them as dry as possible. We really only want to use just the microphones, and then we only want to just carefully adjust the EQ necessary to remove anomalies. We really don't want to boost anything at that point, and we also want to make sure that the microphones are well isolated, so we're only picking up other drums and microphones that we kind of want to. There's no phase cancellation and so forth. Now, when you get a drum machine, all those problems are gone. You're past that. The drums have already been recorded, and now you're mixing. You see the difference there? It's the difference between going and recording the raw tracks and all that being done, that process, and now you go into the next process of music production, traditional music production, which is the mixing. And then there's, of course, a third process, which is the mastering. But when you're dealing with the drum machine, that first process has already been taken care of for you. I mean, you get what you get, of course. If you don't like the sounds, you know, well, you can change them with effect pedals and do a number of other things. Excuse me, a number of other things. But the important thing is that you have pre-recorded sounds that are ready to go. There's no noise, there's no rattling. Everything is well isolated because, I mean, they went in and recorded everything individually. So you've got perfect sounding stuff. And of course, this naturally leads us into talking about sampling, which I don't have time to go into right now. And, you know, actually just taking someone's pre-recorded whole drum measure or two measures of a performance of all of the drums from the drum set and percussion mixed together, and using that somehow, slicing it up or just looping it. That's a whole other topic too. So my point is that for the most part, when you get these electronic devices, these drum machines, they're all going to sound just fine. Really, seriously. They're all great. They're all viable. So at that point, it's a matter of, you know, the interface, how big it is, how it looks, and how does it inspire you. So long story short, and you know, like, where I'm going with all of that is that when I first saw the Behringer RD8, I didn't like it. I didn't like that they had added features to it. It's great and everything, you know, but it didn't click with me. Whereas their RD6, their TR606 clone, that totally clicked with me. I didn't feel like anything that they added was extraneous, and it didn't look like a Frankenstein's monster. Now, that is really unfair for me to say, but that's kind of, you know, that's really the spirit of what I'm trying to get at. Is that when I saw the RD8, it kind of looked like an abomination to me. So I much prefer the Roland TR09. In fact, there's only two issues that I really have with the the Roland boutique version that they have. I don't mind that it's digital one single bit. That doesn't bother me. But the digital ground loop really does bother me. Now I have a $10 solution for that, and it fixes it. It's just an opto isolator. But, ugh. Now, the truth of the matter is, though, is that Roland really anticipated you using this thing totally digitally. They didn't really want you to use the analog outputs. You know, the line out, the headphone out, unless you're using the batteries. If you use the batteries, then you're not going to have that digital ground loop problem. But as soon as you start using either it's only the USB power, and that's probably the problem, is that they didn't have any kind of DC jack. See, the boutiques run off of 5 volts though, so you don't want to really have a 9-volt PSU going into that, because you're just wasting all that 4 volts is getting wasted when you regulate it down with the buck converter or whatever. I mean, you may, you know, and the more waste that you don't create doing that, the more expensive the cost is. But, you know, to tell you the truth, even highly efficient buck converters are pretty darn cheap. So maybe really that's what Roland should have done, but everything's really tiny. You see, it's really, really small. There's not a whole lot of room. And that's just the nature of the beast. So you have to treat your boutiques kind of, you know, gingerly and carefully. You don't want to bang them around too much, because those jacks are PCB mounted, which means that they're connected to the circuit board itself. And if you yank on them too much, you'll disconnect, and that's pretty bad. It's harder to fix than if it's actually mounted to the enclosure itself, and then you got like wires coming off to it. And those are pretty easy to fix. Okay, but back to the RD8, you know, so I don't know why there were problems, and I hope this wind picking up isn't gonna, you know, get caught in the microphone, but it's a nice breeze kicking right now. And so here we have it. So now Behringer has a new version of the RD8. So what's going to happen to all the old RD8s? That's my question. They're just going to get sold around on the market. Will they go up in price? Will they go down in price? Because there's only a handful of them. What's actually the problem with it? How easy is it to turn one of these old RD8s into one of these new RD8 Mark IIs? I haven't looked into any specifications. I don't know if the feature set is exactly the same from the Mark I to the Mark II. It seems to me that there were problems from the get-go with the original RD8, MIDI synchronization, some kind of triggering, I really don't know. Again, I didn't care. I looked at the thing and I said, that's not for me. I decided to get the TR09, excuse me, the TR08, because I loved the TR09 so much. I wasn't even going to get the TR08. I'm not a huge 808 fan, don't get me wrong. I recently was at a bar and somebody played, oh darn, Sir Mix-a-Lot, Baby Got Back, and I realized for the first time that that entire drum part is an 808. I could finally hear it. That's so cool, because when I first got into this thing, into electronic drums and so forth, one of my first, not the first, avenues into this arena was the Roland TD7 electronic drum set. And the TD7 had a pretty cool drum brain. Of course, all the pads were the triggers, you had the trigger inputs, and it was just like a really cool brain that was similar to any other kind of Roland brain. And it had all of their classic 909 and 808 sounds. But of course, at the time, I really didn't understand what any of those, where they came from. You know, those were just names to me, and I associated them with the sounds somewhat, not too much. It wasn't until I actually started looking into these devices on YouTube and I actually got the TR09 and the TR08 that I started to realize, oh, this is what these actually are. And I could start to hear these in songs, and I will continue to this day to go back and hear songs that I haven't heard in a long time, and I'll start to notice these things. It's a really cool phenomenon that you pick up. I'm also now trying to do this with various synthesizers as well, like being able to recognize, okay, that's a whatnot, that's a so-and-so. Plenty of time to pick that skill up. So yeah, we'll see what happens with the Behringer RD8s. You know, if I saw one for like 150 bucks and I knew it was fine, I would be very tempted to pick one up. But I don't know, you know, I don't have room for that kind of thing. I've got synthesizers right now that don't fit up into my current setup, so I'm not looking really to get any of those things. Another problem that, like when I said the look, so what specifically did I not like about the looks? It's the buttons that they added to it. I don't understand why they did that. I'm not a huge, I mean, I'm man, I'm really picky when it comes to buttons. I really, really am. And I make no bones about it, you know, and it just, and not every button is the same either. So like the same button on a different device, it could be good or it could be bad for me. In this particular case, those kinds of buttons seem to work pretty well on the Arturia devices, and even on the Moog Subharmonicon to some degree, although that one I'm kind of still like, I don't really like how they look on that one either. But where else are you going to get a Subharmonicon? And but on the RD8, it just, they don't look right. I don't know why I say that, they just don't look right. The 808 itself is not one of my favorite looking drum machines. I hope that's not blasphemous to you. But if it's, you know, if it is to you, that's great. But to me, the one that I really, the one that catches my eye more is the TR909. There's something about it, I don't know what it is. It looks like a piece of office equipment. And to me, that is just so ironically delicious. You know, that it has this sort of like blue collar, cornflower blue collar kind of look. Not blue, that makes no sense. I'm trying to cross my metaphors there, excuse me. Cornflower blue tie and icons. That kind of like, you know, office space mentality. Speaking of which, I'm not drinking my coffee. Get on that, okay? It's pretty good. It got a little cool, but to tell you the truth, it's getting warm out here, so I don't mind it kind of cooling down a bit. Yeah, that 909, that look, it's just something about that look that really, really appealed to me. So when I got the TR-09, and I loved it so much, that was a couple years ago when I got it, I decided just to go ahead and get the TR-08 as well. And I'm really glad that I did, because I think the two of them together are wonderful. And now I've got a couple 606 clones underneath, and of course the TT-78, which is the CR-78 clone. Which, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, I've got all my classic kind of drum machine sounds that I need. The next step is, of course, using samplers. And I'm excited about using this PadGen firmware on my Volca sample, because my RK02 002 solution just really isn't working anymore. I think I've said this before, but I keep running into the situation where when I fire everything up, depending upon how the MIDI, who's taking MIDI in to out, from where to what, that cable gets corrupted. I think it's the TT303 that's doing it too. I'm not sure on that one. How do you troubleshoot this kind of stuff? It's really hard to troubleshoot this stuff. But what happens is that I no longer, MIDI gets blocked. Something is blocking MIDI, I would presume, on the RK002 cable. It is supposed to allow you to tunnel, or like, what am I trying to say, focus all of your MIDI channels to one channel on the sample. Out of the box, the Volca sample, sample slot 1 goes to MIDI channel 1, sample slot 2 goes to MIDI channel 2, so anything on MIDI channel 2, when it fires, is going to fire on the Volca sample, the second sample slot. See what I'm saying? When you start having a lot of different synthesizers on your different MIDI channels, all channels 1 through 10 are taken up by the Volca sample. That is completely unacceptable. It's okay if you're using CV clock between all the vocals and you're not really using any MIDI for anything. That's great. Or if you don't mind only, well, no, you wouldn't even really be able to do that. I mean, the other option would be to do MIDI filtering, which is what the RK002 does for you. So anyways, long story short, Dave over at Notes and Votes last week installed the PadGen firmware on his Volca sample, and I finally, like, you know, looked into all the specs and everything, and I was like, oh, it solves the MIDI implementation issue for you. There's a number of other things. I'm not interested very much in the randomization, which it's nice to have, don't get me wrong, but I mean, you know, there's so many better ways to handle randomization, that kind of randomization. I don't really like rhythmic randomization. We'll get to that later. Let me fully explain myself before you throw out the pitchforks and the torches and come after me. Let me drink my coffee too first, so I can get my speed up energy to run. But I'm a drummer, right? And there is a certain aspect to how you improv behind a drum set and how you don't improv behind a drum set. And complete randomization is how you don't do it, okay? I mean, you can do whatever you want. When I say these things because they're not rules per se, but they're things that you can kind of understand of why you want to break them or not, why you want to abide by them or not. And more times out of 10, you know, 9 times out of 10, you're going to find that you're better off abiding by the rules than not. When you get bored, break them. That's what it's all about. And then you can actually come up with some really cool experimentation, because you've now started to garner this responsibility, so to speak. It's esoteric, and it's philosophical, and it's highly opinionated, don't get me wrong, but it's music. Everything about music is completely subjective. That's what I love about it. And having said that, it's about time to wrap it up, because the sun is now starting to hit. It's going to hit the camera lens here pretty soon. I brought this out because I wanted to point out this is where I got started. Since this is like the first video that I'm doing of this, just kind of rapping about stuff, might as well talk about where I got started. Here on YouTube specifically, back at the end of, was it 2017? Yeah, November of 2017, I decided to buy this because I saw a Sonic State review of various different pocket operators, and this was the only one that Guitar Center in Nashville had. I didn't know really, at the time, I had no idea about Reverb, or even that Amazon sold these things. So, you know, I just knew to go to like a brick and mortar music store and see what they had. Anyways, no regrets. No regrets. I'm still using it. Still love it. I do have the Mega Man, but that's because I got one for like super cheap. And you know, the Mega Man is the Mark II of this one, and I'm glad that I said that, because you know, for the most part, I'm not a Mark II fan. I wish that it were possible for all synthesizer device makers to have a Mark I and have it be perfect, and not to have to worry about any kind of revisions thereafter. That ain't how it always works, though. Of course, I have two Korgs that are Mark IIs, the EA1 and the ER1, but those are really just kind of aesthetic. They just sort of decided to make, I guess, you know, more upscale versions of those for people who want to have nice looking kind of things in their studio type kind of thing, which I kind of do, must confess. Well, I think that about wraps it up for now. Probably does, and I guess probably the best way to wrap everything up is just to say, I'm not a synth punk, but I used to be a punk rocker back a long time ago. Used to play drums. I still do play drums, but when I first started playing drums, the best way to get started in any instrument when you don't have any formal training is to play punk rock. So I really do appreciate the punk rock spirit and just the punk rock lifestyle, if you will. I appreciate it. I don't live it, and I don't pretend to live it either. Okay, enough of that bullshit.